This is a sword that's also a whip sword. But why did I make it? A little while ago I 3D printed this tiny version and you guys loved it. A bunch of you guys were asking for a full size one, so I made it happen. I turned this little thing into this. And yeah, I tested it on a bunch of stuff, but you guys are gonna have to wait and stick around to the end of the video to see how that went, because first we need to make it. So to start off, I need to make 8 molds, one for each segment of the blade. These molds are going to be filled with resin, which is what the blade's going to be made out of. To make the molds, I first traced out all the shapes onto a piece of paper. I then cut them out and copied them onto a sheet of PVC. I went with PVC because apparently resin doesn't stick to it very well, which is going to be perfect for later on when I need to remove the molds from the resin. Once all the pieces were drawn out, it was time to cut them. I tried to cut them as neat as possible, and now it was time for assembly. I used a hot glue gun to put everything together. Hot glue is great because it's going to hold everything together, but it's not too strong that when I need to pull the molds off later, it won't resist too much. It took a while, but eventually I had all 8 done. Well, actually I had all 9 done because I made one extra just in case things went wrong. Now the most important thing about these molds is that they're watertight. If they're not watertight, the resin can just leak out and make a massive mess. I also need them all to be roughly the same size, so I marked off a reference line on the top of each of them. Anyway, to test for leaks, I filled all of the molds up with water. And it didn't go well. They leaked everywhere. Off camera, I fixed this issue using 36 sticks of hot glue. I also had to use super glue, so hopefully it'll stay together. Time to put the molds to the real test. Mixing the resin. I'm using a 2-part shallow pour epoxy resin. If that means nothing to you, it basically means I have to mix 2 liquids together at a ratio of 1:1, add the color I want the blade to be, and then pour it into the molds. But because it's a shallow pour resin, I can't just dump it all in at once. I have to layer it. In total, I poured 6 layers. Each layer can only be about a centimeter thick. I went with red because I really liked how the 3D printed version looks, and I wanted it to match as closely as it could. After each pour, I had to let it cure for about 6 to 8 hours before doing the next layer. While each resin layer was drying, I got started on the handle. I'm using Jarrah wood, and the handle was going to have 3 components: the grip, a counterweight, and a cross guard. I started with the counterweight. I want it to have a unique center, so I drilled a large hole right through the middle. Later, I'm planning on filling it with resin. But before that, I need to shape it. I cut the bulk of it with a jigsaw before moving onto a grinder to smoothen one side. Once I'd made one side as round as I could, I went back to the jigsaw and cut out the other side, once again using the grinder to round it off before picking up sandpaper and sanding by hand. Although it's not done yet, it's looking good and we're going to put it to the side for now. Next up is the actual handle piece itself. Now, obviously it's not the right shape yet, so I cut off the big pieces on the sides. But I purposely left this massive piece on the end, so then it's easier to clamp to the table while we round out the handle. Sanding didn't take long. By having the piece on the end, it made it a lot easier to get a nice shape. And then later on, when we're finished with it, we can remove it. I ended up with a handle small enough for one hand, but still big enough to fit 2, kind of like a bastard sword. Now for the crossguard. Earlier I mentioned I wanted this build to resemble the 3D printed version, but the crossguard on the 3D printed version I wasn't the biggest fan of, so I decided to switch it up. I think it looks way better this way. What do you guys reckon? Let me know in the comments. I roughly cut the shape with the jigsaw, but still went back and finished it off with the grinder to make it smooth. With all 3 parts of the handle ready, the next step was to fill the hole in the counterweight. Just like the molds, I needed to make sure it was watertight. I sealed up a small crack in the wood with super glue and added a PVC base to the bottom. I mixed up resin one last time, red again, and poured it into the hole. Once it had cured, I removed the base and sanded both sides flat. Then I went and got out my knife and cleaned up any leftover glue. After a week of pouring resin, all the blade segments were finally done. I just needed to remove them from their molds. Along with removing the PVC, I also removed any extra glue. Each segment needed a cleanup. I clamped them into the vise and sanded down the uneven edges to make sure they were all the same size and shape. It's important that they're all roughly the same shape because later on they won't connect together nicely. Then came the sharpening. We're going back to sanding now, but this time by hand. I only sanded the very edge of them to give them a clean and prominent edge. They're surprisingly sharp, and now I've got to be extremely careful not to cut my hand when working with them. Some of the tops dried unevenly thanks to the buckets of glue I used earlier, so I had to sand them down to make them flat before moving on to the final details. The resin looks pretty scratched up from the low grit sandpaper I was using. The bottoms where I didn't sand were very nice and shiny. To get the same shine on the rest, I would have to use a very high grit sandpaper in the thousands, but I could only get my hands on 200 grit for this sander I've got. I also did the same thing onto the counterweight, but I did something a little bit extra as well. I also sanded down one side of the circle until it was flat. You'll see why in a minute. It was time to remove the extra bit of wood on the end of the handle, and we could start on the assembly of the handle itself. To make the handle super strong, we're not just going to use glue. We're also going to drill holes in it and add a peg. A peg pretty much just makes it a lot stronger. But before drilling into the handle itself, I had to drill into a spare bit of wood to make sure I got the right size hole, and it fit perfectly. So it was time to drill into the first bit, and that's the cross guard. After I drilled that hole, I went and grabbed the counterweight and did the exact same thing. But then came an issue. I couldn't get the handle itself under the drill press. It was too long. To solve this issue, I'm just going to clamp it down to the table and drill it by hand. Since I was eyeballing it, it ended up drilling a bit on an angle, but luckily it wasn't too bad. When I held it up against the cross guard, it fit fine, so we moved on to the next part where I cut 2 pegs, added wood glue, and pushed them as deep into the hole as I could. The pegs were a little bit too long, so I trimmed them down before adding more glue and pressing the cross guard on firmly. Then I did the exact same thing with the counterweight. The handle was pretty much done now, so we're going to put it to this side until later on. The next component is to work on how each segment will connect to each other. I've only got the spool of wire left over from a previous project. Cut a rod out and bent it over a block of wood. To make this half chain, I cut out a bunch more of the rods until I had 16 of them. Took it outside, using a hammer and the block of wood, I recreated the half link chain. Once all of them had been bent, I took them back inside and started trimming them so they were all the same size. After some time they were done and they were ready to be used. To actually put them into the resin segments, I'm going to have to drill 4 holes on each side of the resin. Later I'll add glue so they can't come back out. Everything I do to one segment, I need to do to all of them. So I lined up where I'm going to drill and drilled it out on all of them. But simply adding 4 holes isn't going to connect it the way the 3D printed one connected. I needed to find a way for them to clip to each other. This is the 3D printed version, and as you can see, it's a sword, but when you pull on it, it becomes a whip. To do that, I'm just going to use my Dremel. I'm going to cut a slit in each of the blocks, going the opposite way of the metal link above it. The idea is that when they're pressed together, they'll clip together and become the sword. The one thing is, this is very time consuming and took forever. So now would be a great time to say, if you're going to work with resin, please wear the correct PPE. That's a face mask, glasses, and gloves when the resin is wet. Once all the trenches had been cut in every piece, I needed to work on the last segment, the tip of the sword. This one needed to be a point, like an arrow, so I got the jigsaw out one last time and cut it to the desired shape. Once I had it at a decent shape, I got out the sander and started moulding it to its final form, before getting out hand sandpaper and sharpening it. Going back to the handle, I needed to add a link to this, so I lined it up, drilled 4 holes, got out the Dremel, and dug into it. It was finally time to put the sword together. To make it strong and not just fall apart when it holds up its own weight, I'm going to use glue. Now while I was putting this together, I made the decision not to polish the resin as I like the look of it as it is. Anyway, if you like this content, like and subscribe. I'm trying to hit 10,000 subs by the end of the year and I can't do it without you. Once I put on the final piece, I let the glue dry and the sword was done. After weeks of work, the build was finally done, and honestly it looked awesome. It was surprisingly close to the 3D printed version too. The printed one does click together a bit better, sure, but mine still holds its sword shape when it does click together. It felt very weird to hold and even stranger to swing. But now, it's time for the real test. How well does it work? Let's start with the apple. Before swinging, I checked how sharp it was, and yeah, it was sharp. First hit, obliterated the apple. But round 2, the apple won. Turns out super glue wasn't the best idea for holding the links together. That's alright though, because later on I'll fix it up with resin and make it super strong. Next up, a can of Coke. And it stood no chance, totally destroyed it. Then something a bit tougher, a watermelon. I hit it over and over again and it started to break apart. But eventually another segment did come off the sword. Still, I kept on going. I wanted to complete all the testing before I went back and used resin. Now it was time for the final boss, the coconut. Coconuts are strong and I had no hope. And after a few swings, it was clear I was never going to get into the coconut. But overall, the sword did very well. It did way more damage than I was expecting. Although the sword didn't hold up, it was only the links that broke. None of the resin broke, so it was an easy fix. All I had to do was glue it back together using resin, and it was better than ever. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you guys have any ideas of things I should make next, or 3D print, leave it in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.